Hello and welcome to our next chapter in Developmental Psych. I'm sporting a new hat. Just got back from Boston, went to the New England Aquarium. Not quite fitting yet, but anyway, here we are in chapter 7 and leaving childhood and moving into our first chapter on adulthood. And for many years, I've been talking about the fact that more and more research has been coming out supporting the notion that we might need another stage. And that has now become quite official. And it's interestingly, to look at how these things evolve over time in terms of how new ideas then enter into being part of what would be included in a regular textbook for developmental psych. The research, or like the pinnacle article that came out by Arnett regarding emerging adulthood as a distinct stage in between adolescence and young adulthood, came out in 1999, the year I started teaching at KV. And it's just been kind of plugging along in terms of getting more and more evidence and the times changing. And of course, here we are at this time where we do very much recognize this new stage of emerging adulthood and young adulthood. So in this sort of transition time in my own class, I've combined these two to kind of look at them at the same time. So here's an interesting image here. We have this guy here still sitting at home, hanging his PhD, his student of the week. He has all these awards. He's still at home, and we have this sort of sense of, did we fail to launch this individual? Are they ready to go? They're still living at home. You can see the despair on the faces of the parents and whatnot. And what we are actually experiencing at this time is actually this new stage, emerging adulthood. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still issues relating to failure to launch, and this really has to do with our perception of the social clock. Let's go right back to that original topic that we talked about in this class. Is when are we supposed to be out of the house? When are we supposed to be on our own and paying our own bills and doing all that stuff? And when do we achieve independence? And what does that mean? And for different people, that means different things based upon their culture, based upon their family structure, sometimes based upon the financial situation that they're in. We are facing a situation in which children going out of the household cannot necessarily afford the same kind of livelihood that they enjoyed when they were with their parents. Now, this is unprecedented in history. In history, the children have left and have, not of course every case, but have almost always done better than their parents. There's this progression forward. And right now we're in the first period of time where we're not seeing that as much. We're seeing a lot of kids leaving. They're going to college. They accumulate debt. They have different situations that they're going in, and they often return home. It becomes the most logical thing to do. Their jobs simply can't support the kind of rents that are out there or whatever. So let's take a look at what is truly happening in here and getting away from sort of the value judgments that accompany the social clock and saying, okay, kid's 23, 24, 25, why aren't they out on their own? That sort of mentality. And looking at a world that is now, interestingly, more complex, more full of choices. The choices that people have usually take longer to achieve. And of course, the economics are very different. And this has all landed us in this area of this sort of pseudo adulthood. We saw that a little bit in adolescence, taking a few tentative steps into the responsibilities that we call adulthood, but it's definitively happening here in this particular age. So when we look at emerging adulthood, It's a continued age of identity exploration. Much more serious slant to it now, as they're getting their degrees, as they're trying out different jobs. It's an age of instability, continued instability despite the age. An age of self-focus. We're seeing a continuing theme here of what was going on in adolescence, but it has a slightly different flavor to it because they're taking on more adult responsibilities and they're really starting to plan out. Or in all actuality, this is, in adolescence, we're sort of expanding what can I do? And in this period of time, this is my own stuff. I sort of sense this sort of like quirky pruning of things that they would like to do. And I've got to tell you, I'm right in the middle of this with my youngest daughter. She's 25, she's currently living at home, and she's currently really deep in the stage of determining what she wants to do based on a number of choices, and she's clearly recognizing that if she chooses one, it may necessitate that the other one needs to go away or come later. And that sense of picking and the inherent loss of opportunity that comes with that. It's opportunity loss. Like, I'm going to take this opportunity, but by necessity, it eliminates this one. That process is, I think, unique to this particular stage. Not that it doesn't exist elsewhere, but it's a very, very salient quality of this particular stage. So we see this instability and self-focus, but it's really on refining their life plan. A feeling of being in between. I am taking lots of responsibility. I want to be proud of that. I want to be, doing the adult thing, but I'm also aware of my dependence on my home life here. And it's an age of possibilities. And again, I'm going to emphasize that notion of this picking while at the same time losing other opportunities. I'm going to go for this, but I'm also going to lose this. And that sense can be very scary during adolescence and the earlier years of adulthood. There's this sort of, I can do it all. And then there's this sort of stark realization, well, nope, might not be able to do it all, might be able to do some things later, but I need to start, treading the path towards some sort of goal now. And I think that's one of the things that's going on here. Now, this is also the time when I talk about this idea of it's a combination of our clocks here. There's the social clock that determines when this would happen, but there's also the psychological clock as to what we mean by adulthood. And this is going to be part of the assignment that we're going to have in this particular chapter, is defining what do we mean when we call someone an adult. Now, we have legal terms, we have ages, we have 16, we have 18, we have 21, we have these ages of maturity that exist within our law, within our social structure, all of that. But what does it mean to be an adult? If I was going to, let's say, as the assignment goes, if I was going to place an ad, let's just say I wanted to hire an adult to manage my life. I just want to do whatever I want. I need an adult to take care of all my business. What would the job description of that person be? The responsible adult. It's supposed to be me, but say I was going to hire someone to do all that stuff. What would I list as their jobs? What would be their job description? So oftentimes, so leading up to that, each one of us probably has a perception as to what we mean by that. And each one of us probably has a sense as to when we felt that, when we actually felt the point in time in which we're like, oh, I'm an adult now. Some of you may not have felt it yet. Some of you may be partially feeling it. It's not like you get an award in the mail. It's a simply perception, like there's this thing, like something needs to happen, and when that thing happened, it might have been when you got pregnant, or when you actually had the baby, or bought your first house, might have been way earlier when you had your first beer, your first cigarette, whatever it was. There was a point at which, for yourself, you sort of like came on to it. Now granted, I had my first beer very early in life, and I sort of felt adult-like, and it wasn't until much later where I felt adult again, like, oh, now I'm really an adult. And then maybe later it was like, oh, no, now I'm really an adult. And that's perfectly fine. It's sequential events. But we have this notion of what are some ways in which people experience adulthood, this idea of the social clock when it happens. And it is a change in status that goes along with a change in roles. And I'm borrowing these terms from sociology, status being the job title and role being the job description. Now, just reflect upon different things that might have happened to you. When did you think that you became that title? When did you earn that title? And there's still, to me, a very important time. I'll give you an example of mine. Went to college, traditionally went to college right after high school, moved around a lot, ended up in Augusta pursuing my music degree after I'd got my psych degree, and still didn't really feel like an adult. I had my own car, making payments, my own apartment, all of that. And I was actually in Augusta for quite a while, going to school, doing all that. Then I got a new apartment. I had a room in a house before. That was my first apartment. And then I got another one, and I got a phone. And I remember the day, back in the day, the phone company used to send out phone books. So I got the phone book for Augusta, and I looked it up, and my name was in it. And there was something about that particular instance. It wasn't my parents' name. It wasn't, the people that I was living with, and I gave them their number. It was Mark Kavanaugh sitting right in the phone book. And that did it. That was the, wow, I've arrived moment for me. Now, looking a little bit closer now at any one of these sort of things might have been the way in which you experienced your transition into adulthood. Let's take a look at this idea of status and roles here. Of the status we're talking about, the job title, as if I was hiring somebody, is adult, looking for an adult. So what does that mean? What are the roles of an adult? Now, this is an activity. I'm having you actually contemplate this in your assignment, but I'll give you some hints. Be more creative than this, but maybe adults pay all their own bills. Maybe you feel you're never an adult till you have kids of your own. So if you were hiring an adult to manage your life, part of that would be you would have already had kids. That would be a required skill set for that assignment. And I'm going to get a little bit into that assignment later, but I want you to be thinking about, what do adults do? They have a job. They make money. They save money. Maybe psychologically, maybe they are better decision makers. Maybe they, be creative about it. Not just the stuff that they have, but how they think. What sort of separates people who are not adults, regardless of age, and people who are adults, regardless of age. I'm sure you know some people who age-wise are legally adult, but behavior-wise or thinking-wise or whatever, they're not. And it would be like, well, those are important qualities that separate that individual from others who are considered adults. I will return to that when I talk about the assignment for this chapter. Where I want to go now is kind of a switching of gears, another topic that I introduced at this point, because these factors start to become really important in determining that individual's choice of pathways, and that's our models of personality. And the major model that we have is, of course, the Big Five. Now, the first letters of the big five spell ocean. So it's kind of neat to think about. It's easy to remember what it is. So these 5 characteristics, let me tell you where this came from. In all the theories of intelligence, with all the theories of personality, this is a trait theory. The 5 personality traits. It's like measures of certain characteristics. There's tons of different personality characteristics that are measured in all kinds of different tests. That's worthy of a whole class. We have a class on personality that looks at all those different theories. The ocean, those top 5, what they call the big 5, are the ones that seem to appear in all of them. So they're sort of like, cardinal traits. They're important aspects, every one of us could probably relate to some aspect of that particular piece and be able to maybe self-disclose about where we're at with that. And it appears on all those tests. So let's take a look at each one of those characteristics here in this word ocean. So the first one is openness to experience. And this is an individual's degree to which that they are adventurous. Expressions of this might be that they try different kinds of food, that they have a wide variety of interests. And I'm going to borrow from someone who just posted in this week's discussion board, as I'm posting this video a little bit late. They said that they'll hop into the car before they even know where it's going. And so, that's sort of like impulsive sort of aspect of a person's personality. Then we have conscientiousness. Now, conscientiousness is attention to detail, but it also relates to how we relate to other people. This is conscientious is when you take into consideration other people's plans, ideas, emotions. So a conscientious person would be detail-oriented. They would get things done. They're organized, and we're going to see a little bit of that coming out later in one of the other personality traits, but they're very aware of the feelings and notions of other people around them. When you're around a conscientious person, because they're saying like, hey, how do you feel about this? Or you're trying to decide where you're going to go. Now, not the typical discussion between two people, like, where do you want to go to eat? Where do you want to go to eat? And that's worthy of a whole video, that whole thing. And then eventually you're having cereal. You're in a group, and then you have some people that, they have strong opinions about what they want to go. And you'll see the conscientious person is going to go around and make sure everybody can get something there. Okay, we're going to go to Portland Pie. Is everybody cool with that? Let's look up the menu to make sure everybody can get something that they want before we make that decision. That's a conscientious individual engaging in that kind of behavior. Then we have the classic extroversion, introversion. The way I've always defined that is the extroverted person is energized around people. The introverted person expends energy around people. So after a while, the introvert needs some time alone to recharge. And interestingly enough, after a while of being alone, the extroverted person needs some time with other people to recharge. Now, those are extremes. Usually we're somewhere in the middle. And the cool thing about extroversion and introversion is we can act the part. We can be an extroverted introvert. We can be an introverted extrovert when the situation demands it. But there is that place where we get our energy, and that's kind of what we mean by that particular characteristic. Next one is agreeableness. It kind of goes along with openness to experience, but not necessarily. These are nice people. They're great. Just go along with things. They're great. They can still have strong opinions, but in the end, go with the flow. Sort of agreeable people. This is sort of the nice quality. And then we have neuroticism, and this is the individual. It kind of has a negative connotation to it, but not necessarily. It's the individual who wants things done a certain way. very detail oriented. Again, I'm talking about, this is a continuum. You can be a little neurotic. But then if you think about when we joke about, and probably not a good idea to joke about this, but we talk about obsessive compulsive disorder would be like extreme neuroticism. Everything has to be precisely the way it is. Now, for all those openness to experience people and all those agreeable people, when you're planning something, you really want a neurotic individual on the group, because you want someone who's just going to say, okay, hey, wait a minute, how are we going to make this happen? And they just sort of plan things out. And so these are the traits that have developed throughout childhood and adolescence. They come to the front. The individual has built their identity. Some of this they built themselves. Some of it's genetic. They arrive at this decision place, and they will seek out, truly, if you're going to seek out happiness, let's say, you're going to look for people, work, entertainment, situations that fit your personality. So you're going to, this is why I put it here in the content and talk about this notion of who we are attracts certain people to us. We do certain kinds of activities that puts people with similar personalities together. And that's how we meet our best friends, our adult friends, our partners, those kinds of things. We are attracted to activities and people and stuff that matches our personality, and we meet compatible individuals. And so this is a great time to, if you're in that stage of emerging and young adulthood, you're really talking about that notion of really getting to know yourself, firming that up. I'm going to, as I talk about in puzzle pieces, one of the later topics today is identity. When identity is the stage right before intimacy. And intimacy is that important, the Western concepts of finding your soulmate, finding that individual. So developing a sense of who you are, what you like, what you're into, the work that you're doing, and being very conscientious, at least to yourself, about that, being very, very intentional in arriving at those conclusions, builds an individual that is now ready for intimacy. This stage doesn't delay identity development, it pushes intimacy. Individuals are taking more time to develop themselves so that they can select the right partner. And now, I won't go into puzzle pieces yet, but we have a long history of not selecting a good partner because we may have selected that partner. I mean, the United States, we may have selected that partner based on developing aspects of our identity. And therefore, they got, those aspects of our identity, which are going to emerge, maybe incompatible with the individual we thought was ideal. And therefore, as our personalities continue to grow, provided they're not suppressed by neglectful and abusive people that don't want you to change, but as that person changes, and the notion of growing apart can be seen. Now, that doesn't mean you ditch the partners. That doesn't mean, people can grow together. As somebody's growing, and maybe your relationship is based on who you were and not who you've become, but that doesn't mean that relationship couldn't still thrive as each other engages in the lifelong dance of intimacy, of continuing to get to know the wonderful aspects of the person you've chosen to be with. It's not a negative thing that people change, as long as their partners are willing to come along for the ride, and that the changes are negotiated. I mean, there's some changes that are dramatic and may necessitate a change in the type of relationship with that individual, and there's others that may just be challenging and difficult, but there's joy in achieving that challenge. So here we have this whole kind of tapestry of theories here. We have Erikson's theory of identity coming before intimacy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We have this emerging adulthood where different pathways are starting to emerge, and the knowledge of taking a pathway means excluding others, that sort of sense. We have the emerging personality and it, trying to match. I think this is the stress and storm place. I think this is where people, because although adolescents have that sort of like childhood to adolescence, childhood to adulthood sort of transition to make, it's rarely limiting. It's more expansive. There's the loss of childhood, but it's expanding to this world of adulthood. Now that they're in adulthood, the myth of adulthood of being infinite choices disappears, and you realize, I need to make choices now that will impact, at least for the foreseeable future. Okay, now, the other thing that's going on that we see emerging out of adolescence, we see it in adolescence, we demand it in adolescence, and then it comes to fruition, if it's going to happen, is formal operational thinking, or post-formal operational thinking. We are leaving Piaget behind. Formal operational thinking, having manifested, if it's going to manifest, it doesn't have to. If it's going to manifest, it manifests in adolescence, and it has that logical quality to it. But it doesn't take a lot to recognize that adult thinking, remember the assignment, adult thinking is different than adolescent thinking, even though both are formal operational thinking. There's different qualities about adult thinking that make it unique. So that work comes from a psychologist named Shea, who did a lot of work on post-formal thinking. And we have this notion of post-formal operational thinking. What distinguishes adult thinking, formal operational thinking, from adolescent thinking, formal operational thinking? First, absolutes are rare. Black and white things, all or none, those are rare. We recognize as adults that all the time, every time, you just stop quoting statistics. You don't say all the time anymore or you try not to, at least, to say that always happens or this. We recognize that absolutes are rare. There's always exceptions to the case. Simple solutions are also rarely the case. This is actually, so we see this in politics. And politics appeals, or the rhetoric within politics appeals to our desire for a simpler solution to the problems that face us. The complexity of our social situations, the complexity of our social society demands complex solutions. And those are really challenging when you'd rather just why don't we just do this? That appeals to a lower level cognition. It's attractive because it seems complete, but it's not complete. We know that as adults. So adult thinkers are not swayed when somebody says, well, let's just do this and it will solve the economy problem or it will solve the environmental problem. The adult thinkers are like, nope, it's not that easy. It's not easy. There's more things. Subjective factors play a role in defining reality. Individuals' perceptions of a situation, again, this is moving away from that adolescent egocentrism, I see it, the logic is right there, yet on the other side of the table, someone might see it different, operate on the same logic principles, but come to different conclusions. We recognize that as adults. Practicality, flexibility, dialectics, these are our goals in thinking. We want things to be practical, flexible, and dealing with discussions and negotiations. Dialectical thinking is this back and forth quality of finding a solution, having something to do with conscientiousness that, developing that aspect of our personality of getting to an agreement among a group, a middle ground, and finding those things. Frustrating, no doubt. When people have to give a little in things that they're passionate about, we just, like right now, right in the moment, we're looking at a situation with our current president, Biden, who has negotiated an infrastructure bill. Read about it. There's a lot of rhetoric that's going on. And essentially, no one's happy. The middle ground means no one got everything that they wanted, but everybody got something that they wanted. And I think that the notion of doing something is sort of driving this administration and saying, let's do something, but let's be willing to let go of the issues that will keep us from getting anything done, and let's get something done. And different people will view that strategically as, by getting something done, you can then sneak in some other stuff and, whatever. The point is, negotiating a middle ground becomes the goal. Not winning. You actually negotiating, what am I willing to lose to get what I want? And that takes a different level of thinking that is really characteristic of this post-formal thinking. And finally, the idea of emotional intelligence, the notion of being able to understand others and your own emotions and to be able to utilize those in dealing with people. Again, to be nice, to be conscientious, to be understanding of other introverts and extroverts, to be able to engage in dialect, to be able to be flexible and practical, to understand subjective factors. Subjective factors are often emotional. The way we make decisions is often emotional. We know this now with all the things that have been going on in the last few years in terms of fake news and all that stuff, is that a lot of people who will stick to opinions regardless of the facts. Wow, that is definitively a violation. It comes as a violation to adult thinkers that are like, wait a minute, really, the conclusions that I've drawn are really tentative. If new information comes along that pushes them out, I need to be able to do that. I need to be able to let go of these ideas. Hard to do, but nonetheless, this reflects that other level of thinking. Now, I've talked about emerging adulthood, making those choices. Then I talked about personality. And now we just talked about post-formal thinking. And one of the things that starts to really, really coalesce at this point is, of course, career development. Two things, career development and intimacy we're moving away from, I guess, now there's lots of overlap, but we're moving stage-wise, we're moving from emerging adulthood into young adulthood. And in our society, young adulthood is sort of the preparation of two major things that then come in their fruition in the next stage of middle adulthood, and that is career and intimacy. So I'm going to take on career first, and we look at career development in this. And all those factors are going to play in the decisions we make regarding what we do. And I'm going to go right back again to that beginning when I'm introducing identity, and it's, I'm a sort of fan of that concept as being very important in understanding ourselves and others. In our society, when we meet somebody for the first time, family and name are very important. So when we meet someone, we often ask their name, their first name, their given name, and then there's their surname or their last name, which associates them with others. So Mark, my first name, that's the me, and I'm part of a group, Kavanaugh. So those, and then maybe titles after them, maybe a title before that, doctor, or something like that, or, nurse, whatever, or, RN, or line worker, blah, setting those statuses kind of thing. But what I'm looking at right there, those statuses, they have to do with career. And we will put career-related status symbols in front of us, or the next question is, hey, Mark, nice to meet you. What do you do? Meaning it's a huge part of our identity. it doesn't have to be the only part of our identity. It doesn't even have to be the largest part of our identity. But there's no doubt in our society that we put a very, very high level of importance on what we do. That's why people stress about it. That's why people go to school about it, put a lot of thought in it. If you think about, you've been talking about what you want to do ever since you were in kindergarten, and that develops over this whole time. Now, just like there are theories of other aspects of development, there are theories having to do with how do we arrive at the careers that we're in. And probably one of the most famous is represented by this graphic here. This is the Holland model, and he recognized that there are characteristics of jobs that are in any one that, okay, let me because this gets misunderstood. The graphic will take jobs and will put them into these categories. I want you to think that that's somewhat true, that there are some jobs that have a lot of realistic, what he thinks are realistic qualities. There are others that are very artistic. Every job has a component that exists within each one of those. That's the two frameworks I want you to think about. So if you're artistic, it doesn't mean that you can't be an accountant. However, you would probably, however, if you had strong, realistic components of your personality and strong artistic components to your personality, you may be an accountant, but you may be very into the creative elements of that job. Those would be your favorite things to do. The mundane, let's say you're not, the enterprising part, that's not really high. Any enterprising component of that, you wouldn't be attracted to. You might be, for example, you're an accountant and that creative part gets expressed in that job as, I really like teaching accounting and creating graphic elements that explain complex accounting principles. And you really enjoy that part. Or you're a nurse and you like doing training, or you're a social person, but you want to run your own business. And you see how those, when you look at a job, even though that job might be put into one of these categories, you can actually find each one of those categories in that job. So don't feel that, if you're high in artistic, but you're currently going after a conventional job, that doesn't mean that you'd have to change your career. It means you're going to have to find aspects of that job that appeal to all of your personality in order for that job to be most fulfilling. Or you might find other things to do. Maybe you have a very conventional job, but you play in a band. And so you get your conventional joy from your job, and you get your artistic stuff from the band that you're playing in. So let's take a look at this model. We have realistic, and I might have got some of these. I think accounting is actually more conventional here, but you have realistic, practical, scientific, and methodological. So you're public health, veterinarian, those kinds of things. Investigative, epidemiologist, researcher, environmental health. Artistic, we have innovative, creative. Under social, we have enlighten, inform, train. We have enterprising, influence, persuading, and performing. And then conventional, data-driven, analytical, detail-oriented. If you take the Holland test, it gives you a score that shows your highest attraction, let's say, to any one of these. And here's the point I want to make. It doesn't mean you have to pick or, that's what I probably should do. For me, what it is if, let's say you're in a job interview and you're high in realistic, investigative, and artistic things, then the questions you ask when you're interviewing for that job, and of course you want to know how to do it, and you want to know if you're qualified and you're applying for a job that you would like and all that stuff, but you want to ask, how am I going to meet my artistic, investigative and realistic aspects of this job. So you're applying for that conventional accounting job and you say, well, okay, but I'm very investigative. So let's say you're working for an accounting firm, you might ask, is there like a forensic accounting component to what you do? I'd be interested in learning more about that, because that investigative problem solving, and in that case, criminal activity might be, or maybe, I'm looking at programming, I want to learn how to solve some of these accounting problems related to stocks or whatever. There you go. That's how you're exploring your particular tendencies in this area within any job that you're applying for. What I think you might find is that your personality, expressed in this way, has drawn you into the professions that you're probably majoring in. That we are, just like your ocean attracts you to different jobs and different people and whatnot, you sort of been carving your way out, and maybe there are some jobs that would never even come within your field of operation because they're just too far away, and those things are not even on the table, but you're looking at the things that are there and they fit. They fit because you've been picking them all along. You like characteristics of those jobs. You like characteristics of the people that work in those jobs. Now, the fact remains that while career counseling, all the way back to our guidance counselor in high school, really do a lot of focus on this kind of planned out, here's what I'm good at, here's what I like to do, here are the environments that I like to work in. That's principally the Holland test. While that is true, the fact is that when we do research on individuals who have found, quote unquote, and it's really important to recognize, people who have found that they recognize a dream job and have that notion of, I never thought I would be doing this. There's lots of examples of that, more than you would think. So we have all this planning, we have career development seminars you can go to. Our entire school system is based around career development. But yet, often people will find happiness in places they never anticipated. And that's brought out a new theory in career development called happenstance, which is chance. Now, this is an interesting theory because it represents that even though people are going through the process of making specific decisions, rational decisions, planning, going to school, getting certificates, doing all that stuff, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a certain element that comes from being open to opportunities that may present themselves by chance. Because many times when people have interviewed, researchers have interviewed those individuals who came to their jobs, they didn't plan it, and they love their jobs, will often describe chance encounters that led to them getting that job. So they might have got laid off, and then they went over to a restaurant and they're sitting there, and while they're standing in line, let's say waiting for a table, and they get into a conversation with the person next to them, and there's a mutual interest or something like that, and then that leads to a connection later. They call each other, the person's starting a new division of their business, they're looking for an innovative thinker, and then this chance encounter sitting in a restaurant line ends up in that person's dream career. And it is unusually common. So there's a notion that we would remain ready for that. Now, the notion of planning and, the neurotic individual will want that plan to work out. But it's to nurture a certain sense of openness to experience, that I got this plan going on, but I'm also keeping my eyes open for opportunities that may present themselves. Now, happenstance thinking requires that you are observant, that you are networking, that you are prepared to move, make changes, and, this is an interesting one, that you plan for periods of unemployment, that you save up. Let's say there might be an opportunity, let's say, even if you just change job, even if you're in a job and then an opportunity comes up and like, I don't know, I'd really think I'd like to try that, and you make that change, there's going to be a lapse in your income for a while. But if you plan for that, plan to have money in savings, whatever it is, a couple months worth of the money you would need to make all your bills, and say, okay, I can make a change and go without a paycheck for a while in order to pursue opportunities that may not be immediately paying. So that kind of sense of preparedness for happenstance is sort of what individuals are building in to their equally important planning procedures for career development. So as much as you're planning for the pathway that you want to create, for you laying the tracks of the train called your career, you might also get your ducks in a row in terms so that you're ready, lighter on your feet, in order to be able to make some quick changes if you need to do that when opportunity arises. Okay, all of this, of course, has all brought us to Erikson's theory, this young adulthood theory here we have down here, intimacy versus isolation. So we have this development of the self, and I really emphasize this in the next topic of puzzle pieces, this idea that identity comes before intimacy. We see adolescence. Let's sneak another stage in there in between adolescence and young adulthood as emerging adulthood, and all of these are refining the self, getting it ready for intimacy. Now, all along, we've also been dating. Maybe we even got married, in that early place, and just understanding that individuals who get married early in today's world have to negotiate their personality growth through that period of time and for the rest of their lives. Actually, that doesn't change. That negotiation doesn't stop. People are always changing, and so that idea of intimacy being what's happening in this stage, Erikson really felt, at least in the observation, that identity is largely developed before the intimacy comes along. It's probably important to keep in mind that Erikson was wise about that one does come before the other, at least substantial identity development before intimacy. Now, of course, leading into my theory of puzzle pieces. Okay, now this is my own work, and I'm going to leave it to most of the writing because it's a complex idea, but I became interested in this notion that identity needs to come before intimacy. Because when I was working as a social worker and for a very brief time as a therapist, I encountered a lot of individuals who were, for lack of better terms, and just to jump to the end of it, they essentially had identities that were based on other people as opposed to based on the construction of their own sort of, to a degree. Now, intimacy necessitates a merging of identities. That's really what Erikson was talking about. That when you're in a successful, intimate relationship with someone, you negotiate things together and you grow together. Sometimes you grow almost like a dance. You grow apart and then you come together, and you grow apart and you grow together. This kind of fluid breathing of that relationship is sort of the cognitive ideal of a rich, engaging, intimate relationship. When somebody tries to hinder that and keep you from dancing, or doesn't want you to dance, or doesn't want to go on the dance floor with you, speaking figuratively here, then that can create problems in that relationship. I met a lot of individuals who they never led the dance. They were simply being spun around, and often because they were coming to therapy, these relationships were not very positive, and in some cases were extremely abusive and neglectful. And so I started getting curious about the basic question of why would someone stay in that relationship, except that it exemplified a situation in which somebody's developing identity basically very early on merged with another and became dependent on that individual. So it's sort of an addiction, sort of dependency that can be created even though that relationship is destructive. Now, there's lots more detail in that in terms of the theory. And truth be told, I'm still doing research on this. I'm still exploring it. This summer, I'm hoping to put some of that to paper and really start developing what I would like to see as a book that explores these ideas. But nonetheless, we have this concept of intimacy as a result of two individual identities coming together and negotiating a relationship. Puzzle pieces, the analogy comes from constructivism, which is Piaget's creation of our schemas that we create through assimilation and accommodation. Boy, look, bring those words all from the archive here. We have a construction of our identity, ourselves, who we see ourselves as. And that there's complexities there in terms of how we create that. Maybe we have some pieces that have already been created for us, foreclosure. Maybe we have others that we've carved ourselves, and maybe we changed our mind as we were trying to shape that particular piece of us, and that would be an achieved aspect of our personality, bringing in Marcia's theory. But we create a puzzle, and each one of those pieces fits together to create an image called your identity. We do not have the benefit of the box, so we don't have the final picture. So of course, this is a lifelong construction of our identity. And what I'm asking you to do is to read that as a series of thoughts that I'm having in terms of the interrelationship between expectations from society, early negative experiences, relationships, the role of role models, what we see on TV, the expectations, realistic or not, of relationships and all that, and seeing how that unfolds in the development of problematic, but also in the development of very healthy relationships. So I'm trying not to have the theory just focus on why it came about, because I wanted to find out why individuals stayed in such negative relationships. But it's also a descriptive theory about how relationships really happen and what we can do to fix them when there's things that go awry. And so that's the theory of puzzle pieces. You can read about that in its sort of condensed form, and hopefully someday in the future you'll buy my book. That would be really cool. So we're at the end of our chapter content here, and our assessments are as follows. There's 2 discussions. Chapter 7 discussion A is about the Big 5 personality test. Chapter 7 discussion B is a free form talk about what'd you like, what didn't you like, does it match your experiences, about my theory of puzzle pieces. And we have a quiz where you're going to take the Big 5 test, but you're also going to take the Holland test. And for this particular quiz, I want you to keep in mind those 2 views that I have of the Holland test. There's the Holland test that says, oh, you're high in investigative, so you should be a scientist. That pinpoints a career that has a lot of that in it. I also want you to look at your career that you're already on the path to, and based on the Holland test, speculate how you might meet those wants, those desires, how much you meet the artistic, how much you meet the investigative, how much you meet the conventional based on your results in the career that you're looking at. Because those will be the things about your job that you probably enjoy the most. There's always things you don't enjoy. I'm artistic. I love putting these slideshows together. It's just fun to play around the graphics and animation because it's a fun artistic thing to do. Grading, not so much. I don't score high in that, traditional area. So I tend to neglect that. And so just aspects of our personality expressed, it doesn't need to necessarily point us away in a different direction. So I'm asking you to in the quiz, maybe you're looking at a particular job and it fits right in your best one. You talk about that, but also talk about your other traits and how your career direction, or even what you're doing right now, and even your hobbies might be the ways in which you are achieving those things. And then, similar to the last couple weeks, we have an assignment here, and that is the adult job description, and that's going to be due in a couple weeks. So the first week here, this week, we have Chapter 7, Discussion A, discussion being the quiz, and then next week, it's going to be the assignment. So I want to take a little look right now as to that particular assignment. We're looking at this model here. I've asked you to consider the job title, adult, and the role, job description. What does an adult do? What do they have? What do they think? And I want you to imagine that you've hired someone and you're going to evaluate them. Now, the person you've hired is yourself. So you have on paper, you're going to write this out. You write out all your characteristics, and then you create a Likert scale that's going to score yourself. How well have you done? So let's say pay all your own bills. That's one that you think should be on the list of adult. So you look at that and you 1 to 5, 1 being never, I didn't pay any of my own bills, 5 being I paid all of my bills. You might say, well, I pay all my own bills, but my parents pay my phone. So maybe I'm going to score myself a 4. And the scoring is in the last 30 days. In the last 30 days, how successful was I in achieving all of these characteristics of adulthood? No one should have 100%. Well, maybe. I won't say no one. No absolutes, right? Remember? Adult cognitive thinking. But there should be rare that you should be times like, no, it really wasn't. Maybe I delayed that. Maybe I didn't pay that bill. Maybe I think that to be an adult, you have to have your own kids, and I don't have any kids yet. So I'm not an adult yet. So I'm going to score pretty low on that one. But I score well on other aspects of adulthood. But I wouldn't get this job because I think it's really necessary that people should have kids before we call them adults. That's okay. What I want to see at the end is you having that, score at the end of the last 30 days based on your own description as to the job of an adult. List is at least 10 things, right? And score yourself and reflect on that. You can also score your spouse. You can also score your person that you are interviewing. You can share this as a family sort of thing as to, if you have kids that are emerging adulthood, what a great thing. It's like, this is what I think adults do. Have them come up with their own list. What a great discussion over dinner as to what we each think is adulthood and what does that mean and where they're at. That can lead to a lot of very rich conversation. Hopefully not a whole lot of arguments. So we have this Likert scale here, never, usually, half the time, usually. Unusual, all the time, the scoring. And you end up, if you had 10 on there, then the highest score would be 50 and the lowest score would be 10. So 50 would be, wow, you're rocking it all the time in all aspects of this being an adult. And if you had a 10, you'd be, well, you're still in daycare or something like that. So there you go. So that's our introduction to Chapter 7. Make sure you read the text as well. There's all kinds of stuff I don't cover that's really cool that's in there. And make sure you get the sequence of weeks here. We're in, again, one chapter over 2 weeks. So we have the discussions in the quiz due this week, and then you have basically 2 weeks to get the assignment done. And make sure you go in. I might have missed some instructions. The instructions are in the course book on how to fully do that assignment and comparing with others and whatnot. In class, I usually pair people up and they rate each other. And so feel free to reach out to your friends or even other people in class to compare each other's lists and to rate each other and how well did you do on their list? How well did they do on your list? You know, that kind of play around with this as much as you want. And please get outside and enjoy the weather. It is scorching hot today. And I wish you a very good week, and I will see you in the discussions, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, particularly about my puzzle pieces theory. I like hearing about that. So take care.